Great, thank you everyone for joining the next session. I hope you can hear me all okay. We've got a fantastic lineup of panelists who I'll introduce briefly. So this session's about mineral security amidst great power rivalry. And I'd like to first introduce to my left Isabel Hilton, a RUSI Senior Associate Fellow, founder of China Dialogue, excellent website on China and the environment, and Chair, Center for Investigative Journalism. Next, we have Dr. Pragna Kiri, Head of Consultancy, Minviro. And then Mike Blakeney, Head of Government and Public Affairs at the Cobalt Institute. And then, last but not least, Finnegan, Chief Operating Officer at Techmet. So this is obviously a big topic and lots to say. But we've got a really decent amount of time, and I will open it up to audience Q&A towards the end, so feel free to jump in with questions. But starting with you, Henry, first of all, when we think about critical minerals and great power rivalry, we're talking mostly China and the US or the West and China. Just starting off, how have you seen the critical minerals markets? How have they been changed by what we've all seen, which is an increase in tensions between China and the West, and really the bringing of critical minerals into the sort of national security discussion? How has that changed markets over the last few years, do you think?
Thanks. Yeah, that works. So maybe just a quick bit of context of who Techmet is. Techmet's a private investment company based in the EU that invests in the supply chain of the key critical minerals for the energy transition. So I would say not copper, but pretty much all the other key critical minerals. So battery metals, cobalt, lithium, nickel, rare earths, vanadium, tin, and tungsten. And we invest in projects in extraction and extraction technologies, processing, recycling, and also supply chain marketing and trading, physical trading. We founded Techmet in 2017 when critical metals were not really well known. They are a buzzword now. Everyone's talking about critical minerals, critical metals, and chucks them all into one basket. And they're all very different market dynamics, but clearly there are generalities over, all of them. We were somewhat of a voice in the wind with a number of other people who were banging the drum, saying we need to deploy a lot more capital, and we still do, huge amounts more capital to feed the energy transition with the inputs for renewable energy systems, batteries, EVs, and so on and so forth. And obviously, Henry, I don't know if anyone follows Benchmark's work, but Benchmark have been another proponent of these critical minerals and the supply-demand dislocation. One of the key, when we set out Techmet, we nailed our colours to the mast, and from inception have been aligned to Western interests and to the US and its allies' interests in the face of Chinese dominance in the supply chain. China has been absolutely pivotal in the ramp up of these metals, and without them, we wouldn't be anywhere near where we are. So we're not anti-China, but we are definitely aligned to the US and its allies' interests. And we are quite unique in the fact that the US government are actually shareholders of ours. So they're one of our largest shareholders, which is, I think, totally unique in a natural resources focused company. So there's been a massive change over the last, kind of 5 years as people have realized that this is going to be a huge, huge problem. We were still telling people that EVs actually worked when we started Techmet. So we've come a massive way. I think, clearly China, and I agree with who was the panelist from the Oxford Institute of. He was saying it may not have. Anders, thank you. Yeah, Anders. I agree with Anders saying it may not have been a kind of systematic approach from China right from inception, saying, right, this is this is the quantity of lithium we need, and this is that we need. But it was definitely a key part of their industrial policy to ensure that they were going to be leaders in the 21st century global economy, and solar, wind, EVs, battery storage, and they did go on a sort of a 20-year journey of building processing, building supplies where they didn't have them domestically, going and financing offtakes, financing projects, huge governments, huge Chinese subsidies, state-backed companies, playing across the world, but in key places that we all know of: Indonesia, DRC, South America, and clearly they're everywhere. I think the US sort of woke up several years ago and realized they were miles behind. Europe has woken up and realized it's miles behind. The difference is the US came to the table with with massive bits of legislation that really do move the needle, and the IRA is a fantastic first start at trying to redress the total dominance that China has in the markets. We're seeing that the current market dynamics are sort of detract from the long-term issue of the energy transition. We're still, metals prices have been are at sort of reduced levels, but this is kind of a temporary thing. In terms of the long-term outlook for critical metals and the energy transition, we need a lot more of these metals coming online, and the short-term issues in dampening is a result of, in different markets, a lot of different things. But China's clearly massively involved, and they've managed to keep the prices very, very much lower than they need to be to incentivize new projects coming online. And that's a big, big problem for the West, because the gap, the supply-demand dislocation is going to be even greater when the real demand from the energy transition does actually come. And China will have consolidated their position even more. And more ESG compliant projects around the world just aren't coming online. So it's a major issue in the West, and very little money has been put into the upstream part of the supply chain, where the IRA has been fantastic, but it's been, a lot of the funding has been kind of mid to downstream, building battery factories, all the rest of it. Whereas very little has been put into the upstream and financing new projects to come online. And basically, what the bottom line is, the Western world needs to somehow replicate what China has done, and encourage vast amounts of money, vast amount more than has been in the upstream part of the supply chain to bring projects online for the future. I mean, I'll stop there, just keep rambling on.
No, that's great. And Mike, I'd like to bring you in now, because Cobalt is sort of a microcosm of perhaps China's tactics, or at least the problem of investing in the current environment. The Cobalt market, we need Cobalt for lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles, but the price has plummeted. And we have one producer, Chinese company, I won't give their name, who's the biggest Cobalt producer in the world now, and they've just increased production, increased supply into a falling market. What do you see? Has this deterred Western miners from investing in the current environment?
Yeah, so Is this working? How it's working. I think this is really the million-dollar question. And just before I start, so my name's Mike Blakeney. I'm Head of Government and Public Affairs at the Cobalt Institute, and we are the global trade association for the cobalt industry. The other thing that's worth noting is we represent the whole value chain. So we represent miners, we represent recyclers, we represent refiners in the midstream, down to end users, battery manufacturers, even traders on the financial market. So that gives us a really holistic view of the supply chain. We don't take an interest in any one part of it, we take an interest in the whole of it. I mean, with this particular question, I think it speaks to a broader issue, which is we often talk about price volatility. And what I mean by that is right now the price is very low, and that's bad if you're trying to invest in new midstream or upstream capacity, but it's great if you're in the downstream. On the other side, if prices are really high, it's great if you're in the midstream and the upstream, but it's bad if you're in the downstream because it increases the cost of your material. So we often talk more about, I mean, I'll come on to the low price in a second because it's important, but we often talk more about price volatility as being the main barrier, because what I often hear when I speak to my members and others in the industry, I mean, there's an uncomfortable truth, going back to some of the comments Henry made, which is actually we need to be quite glad that China has made the investments it's made in the last 30 years, because it hasn't displaced Western investment. It has been the only investment in town. And I think we have to start with a moment of self-reflection and say, why are we not making those investments? Why actually have we actively disinvested in some of these cobalt mining assets, but I'm sure it's true of other mining assets as well, rather than finding new investments? There's a whole range of reasons. I can come on to those in a second, but I won't now. But one of those is, as we say at the minute, is the price is very low, and it is a disincentive to bringing on new capacity. But it also speaks to some of the broader issues, and I'm going to use some benchmark figures because, of course, they are infallible. And the forecasts suggest that for cobalt, whilst we're in a period of oversupply right now, actually by about 2030, we're going to be in a period of undersupply. And so we have to ask ourselves, we're in this really strange situation. The price is low, so it prevents people from investing. But by the time those refineries, mining takes a bit longer, but refineries certainly come online, we actually expect, or we would forecast, that would probably have changed. I mean, demand and pricing don't, necessarily aren't locked in, but that certainly seems to what the benchmark figures tell us. And so how do we then in that environment get people to invest? And for me, I think this is really at the heart of our challenge. And I think, it's a very complex issue that we're not going to be able to do a service to today, but it speaks to the heart of why are Western investors not interested in investing in mining, refining capacity. I mean, we talk about mines in the DRC in this case, but refining in the UK. I mean, we've got 2 cobalt refineries in the UK. Why can we not have more? The second largest country for refining cobalt is Finland. So you can do this profitably and successfully in sort of developed economies, but today 70% of that refining capacity is in China. So if we want to change the needle, we need to talk about investment, and I think that's why it's great Henry's on this as well as you. One thing I would just leave you with is I actually think when we talk about the challenges, there's a lot of negativity. What can we do? China's got this stranglehold and it's really terrible. I guess there's a point where we have to move on to saying, what can we do? And for me, actually, I have to say, because as UK policymakers in the room, UK is in a really good position because it's got 4 things that nearly no other country has. Number one, counterintuitively, it's got some quite low-cost areas that have great transport access. So think Teesside, Merseyside. Both of those cobalt refineries, by the way, are in the Merseyside area. We also have a huge amount of commodities expertise, world-leading, frankly, commodities expertise. I mean, Henry, I'm not going to be too quixotic about you, but of course, Benchmark is one of the world-leading analysts on these. So we've got Benchmark, we've got Fast Markets, we've got a whole range of other people. So we've got commodities expertise, we've got the investment capacity, we've got one of the most liquid financial markets in the world with commodities expertise, and we've got mining expertise. So I actually don't think it's ridiculous to say we could be one of those countries that is investing and leading on this stuff. But going back to your original point, which I think is the key one, we are, I would say, in a distorted market. I'm not referring specifically to China there. I think it's true generally. I mean, the EU is increasingly active in this space. We've got the US with, frankly, massive subsidies in this space. And so if we do want to leverage what I think is our comparative advantage, that also has a role for government in saying, well, how do we offset some of that market distortion to allow that investment to take place in Britain? And I don't think, frankly, the IRA is the best example, because it's been successful, but it's a huge amount of money that I would say has mostly succeeded, in my experience, of simply moving investment from Europe to the US rather than creating new investments. And so I think there is space for people to come in, learn from what worked, learn from what didn't, and do it better.
Yes, no, interesting. And Isabel, just to ask you, and feel free to raise your hand for questions as well as we go. But Isabel, just to ask you, it is interesting to see Western economies, US principally, who were avid free marketeers, sort of try to outdo China, or do a China, and go full throttle industrial policy, to the point where we had Janet Yellen being lectured in Beijing about how market economies work. But do you think, trying to outdo China in industrial policy just risks distorting these markets even more, and we're not going to be able to sustain our industrial policy for the length of time that China can?
Well, I think the most important part of that question is can we sustain it? Because, I think we have been, asleep at the wheel for quite a long time. And, I mean, not perfectly understandably, there were a series of assumptions that were made 15 years ago, which turned out not to be entirely reliable. I mean, there were, for example, the assumptions that China would go on being, if you like, a responsible global player in the style of Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao. We didn't allow for a return of, muscular nationalism and a return of state-backed ideology to the degree that we've seen it under Xi Jinping. We didn't, I think, allow for, although perhaps we should have seen that one coming, the impacts of US-China competition across all fronts, which means that if you're looking at the security aspect, and we're now in a position, as we all know, of dependency on China for across a great range of goods, services of all kinds, and we've transferred a lot of expertise and lost a lot of expertise, so recovery is difficult. But we're now in a security landscape which is infinitely broader than it was in the Cold War, and given the relationships of our economies and our industrial needs, that very much complicates things, and we are having to make a lot of decisions about the free market, which may have been an appropriate policy. We reap the gains of free market, of the China price, of transferring to, and indeed the China market. We reaped all those benefits without perhaps envisaging that this could go wrong. And frankly, we got to a point where it went wrong because China changed its policy, or China then began to reap the benefits that it could see of the situation that had been created, and leaving us in some difficulty as to how to respond, which is why after, 20, 30 years of free market ideology, we are seeing a revival of interest in industrial policy. But as Mike has pointed out, you need a certain resilience in order to counter China's policy. China made a whole series of decisions in around 2009, 2010, which were about investing for a future technology landscape and becoming the dominant supplier of goods and services to a carbon-constrained world, and invested over a great length of time, a great deal of money in that, in achieving that goal. So, can we match that? I sort of doubt it. Can we make the sort of choices which say, if we choose to protect this particular industry, either through local content requirements or tariff barriers, can we in effect create a native industry to substitute for Chinese imports? Are we willing to sacrifice the advantages of the China price in order to benefit our economies, and would it benefit our economies? So we're having to make a whole set of decisions which I think were unanticipated and which we have been very slow to recognise, and we're coming to it rather late in the game. But industrial policy, I think, is the next step. The market is distorted. The question is, how do you operate? How do you protect yourself in a distorted market?
Got it. And Pragna, just turning to sustainability, a few years ago, one of the ways Western companies tried to get a competitive advantage was to say, we're going to be greener than the Chinese competition. I think of companies saying they're going to produce the world's greenest battery, but that's changed slightly in that Chinese companies are increasingly embracing sustainability. Is that no longer a competitive edge for the West then, do you think?
I wouldn't go as far to say that it's no longer a competitive edge. I think that what we are seeing is China are starting to take standards and the European standards more seriously, and therefore are exploring developing their own, particularly for when competing in the battery value chain, and really when you look at the whole value chain and the supply chain, for batteries, and you see that an example is lithium mined in Australia, shipped to China, processed, upgraded, and then shipped to the EU to then go into the rest of the supply chain and electric vehicles that are then produced in Europe. And if you're assessing the impacts, the environmental impacts of that whole supply chain, it is obviously going to be a lot higher than if we had the supply chain anchored closer to home, closer to the domestic production. So in that regard, we would still win. So it's all about looking at the full picture, and all of the steps that go into mining through to even recycling, and an angle that I think isn't really explored enough for Europe and the UK is the recycling aspect, because directly from that we would be able to process all of those end-of-life materials here, and we would extract that value immediately, and that can then go back into the supply chain, and the impacts for recycling do benefit from looking at the whole life cycle of a product. Yeah.
And do you see Chinese miners, refiners coming to Europe, meeting the standards here? Would that increase the costs significantly, or would they still be as competitive?
From a cost perspective, I think, it would. Sorry, repeat that question, actually.
Just if we see those Chinese companies come to Europe, operate with our standards, EU standards, would that erode their cost competitiveness, or would they still be competitive?
I think they would erode. I don't see that. What the Chinese players are looking at is how can they produce, how can they switch to renewables? Because right now they are heavily reliant on coal, and exploring, hydropower or solar, so that they can meet the standards for shipping their materials to Europe. In terms of them coming to Europe, I don't see that would actually happen. Mm-hmm. I think they don't want to be kind of singled out and not be able to sell into Europe.
Got it. And Mike, I'd be interested, because in Cobalt, we a few years ago, we saw a huge amount of focus and concern about sustainability of Cobalt, child mining, other issues in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which at the time we saw companies like Tesla then sign deals with Western mining companies like Glencore, others, to avoid some of those issues. But have you seen that the Chinese companies have improved their standards, reacted to that concern, so that they now can supply the Western automakers?
Yeah. I mean, I guess my first answer to that would be, I think we need to be careful framing Chinese companies as if they're one homogenous blob, because of course there is a scale and there's a huge variety, and some are actually quite responsible actors with ambitions to sell into Western markets and meet high standards and are accredited by respected standards. And there are ones who probably would fall short if they were accredited. I mean, I guess I would also just say, I think there's this challenge to saying, well, because I have seen this come up, see people saying, well, if we set barriers around high ESG and green standards, so let's say you can only use these materials in Europe if you can meet certain high ESG and green standards, as a proxy trade barrier with China. Now, my question with that is that I think many of these Chinese companies could probably meet those if they wanted. I don't think it's an impenetrable barrier. And if your aim is to try and increase standards, great. I mean, it's worked. If your aim is to try and exclude Chinese companies, be careful what you wish for, because you might find that actually they're still doing business and they're competing and they're doing it on a high ESG basis. I mean, I guess more fundamentally to, I think, the broader point of your question about child labour in the DRC and the issues we see, I want to address that point specifically because we're always very clear. Actually, the best way to deal with some of those sustainability standards is to bring responsible companies into those countries. And this, again, I know it's going back on my same hobby horse, but this is an investment question, because what we've seen in the last 15 years is that many of those companies that have high standards, act very responsibly, have left the DRC in part because of the reputational and political risk that has come with operating in the DRC, not only, but in part. And that has left the space open for people who have fewer qualms about working in those sorts of high-risk environments. So actually, counterintuitively, we've ended up in a situation where potentially what you're doing by disinvesting is lowering the standards. The counterpoint is to say, well, if there are companies that do follow the standards, how do we make sure that they feel comfortable making those kinds of investments? I have some thoughts on that. I won't go into it now because that could be another 20 minutes. But
Henry wants to jump in.
I'll continue on that theme. I mean, I totally agree. If the West says we're not going to invest here, it's going to make the problem worse. But what about in the DRC? I mean, has there been an almost total move out of the DRC, so that 15 out of the 19 copper cobalt producers are Chinese? Because of the reputational risk, a lot to do with the reputational risk, and there are assets that are available, but they don't want to go in because it's a major problem in the capital markets for them, and how that could affect their price, and it's a huge risk. So you have to have the kind of backing from Western governments to fully support and subsidize, the huge spending on ESG that'll have to come in. I mean, I don't think it's that difficult for the Chinese to up their game massively. Why not? Why couldn't they just, it's not going to cost a huge amount more, and they're subsidizing their operations anyway. But the evidence doesn't point to them. I mean, I don't know where the Chinese are really great actors in a lot of these critical metals. I mean, just take Indonesia. It's a massive disaster. So you've got, coal-fired power stations pumping out, carbon dioxide to power HPAL, and then you've got all the acid waste, you've got the deforestation, you've got the social issues, and they're doing this to pump out cheap sources of nickel, and guess who can't compete with that? Australia, Canada, who have got much more ESG compliant nickel processes, and there are much more. We've got a nickel project in South America, which is pioneering heap leaching, which is not a new technology, but heap leaching of nickel laterites is a new process, and that would be in the lowest kind of 5% of CO2 emissions. These are the kind of projects that, and actually it's very low on the cost curve too. So at these prices, it's still a good project. But a lot of projects just won't come online, and so even if they get to a point where, in nickel, it's just not going to be ESG compliant. It's not going to be, it's going to have a big carbon footprint, and that's a problem. But let's say they do. If the West doesn't create an independent supply, it's not like the China is suddenly not going to be an authoritarian government who are going to use the leverage they have over these metals as geopolitical leverage. So we have to diversify, and that means intervention. And the spending in the metals markets, I totally agree. The UK has got so many attributes that it could bring to bear, but we don't. We haven't really. No one's really playing in the critical mineral space in the majors. Okay, apart from a few examples, and I've taken copper out of it because it's a big commodity where the majors play. But BHP, Vale, Glencore, Anglo, they're not in the kind of niche markets. They're playing around a little bit, a bit in nickel, a bit in lithium, starting to do, but they want to deploy money in big projects, and you can't deploy the kind of capital from the outset in the big projects that are going to move the needle for their shareholders. So how do we incentivize that? How does the UK government incentivize that? And that's a big question, because there hasn't been any, that there are lots of mechanisms one could use. The White House is starting to talk about potentially using price floors, so investors can come in knowing that there's going to be some sort of stability. But there are, and we're recipients of DFC funding, and there are ways of, but it's like scratching at the surface compared to what the IRA's done further down, or could do further downstream. But the bottom line is, Western governments have to get serious about incentivizing the private sector to invest into this space. Sorry.
No, you're right. And the US, as you said, we've seen this extraordinary piece of legislation, Inflation Reduction Act. We've seen the political will to support investment in minerals, but we haven't actually seen that much upstream investment. In addition, the IRA, the countries that aren't eligible are those which don't have free trade agreements with the US, and that is Democratic Republic of Congo, Indonesia, Argentina. So it cuts out a lot of those countries. So how successful do you think it has been in promoting investment in critical minerals?
It's quite early to tell on with the Inflation Reduction Act how it's going to impact the upstream. I mean, we still haven't had anywhere near the amount of investment we need to, but that's due to other things. That's to do with metals prices and things. So. I mean, the IRA could look further upstream to see how it can promote that. I think the IRA, the incentives, and we've got a project in Brazil. That doesn't have a FTA agreement, I don't think, currently. The EU doesn't have a FTA agreement, right? So how the IRA is actually implemented over a series of administrations will change, and I think it'll be pragmatic about, I don't know, but I would have thought that the common sense will prevail where you can. We're building a Brazilian nickel project that we know that we can sell that nickel into Western supply, and it will eventually, but we don't. But it hasn't got a free trade agreement yet. But I don't know is the answer to how the IRA will affect the upstream at this stage. And
that nickel, would they pay a premium for it over the Indonesian supply, or what would incentivize them to buy Brazilian nickel?
I don't know if there'll be a premium for sort of for independent supply of critical minerals. There will, if you obviously there are sort of incentives like the IRA comes in and effectively subsidizes it for the end user. I think that, it's hard to tell.
Mike, just turning to you about the IRA. As I said, DRC isn't included as an eligible country. But yeah, at the same time, that is one country where you see a lot of US focus in trying to combat China's investment there by various means. Even recently, sort of intervening in an acquisition to say, actually, don't sell it to a Chinese company, am I right? And look for alternatives. So what's the impact of US policy been on the DRC and on the cobalt copper market?
Yeah, I mean, one thing we've missed is that obviously there's another two jurisdictions that aren't FTA partners, the UK and the EU,
Yeah.
which, is of course a big gap. And, it's kind of, it was funny in the early days, they've closed it with the fiat rules, but in the early days you could be a Chinese company operating in Chile and you could get a tax credit, or you could be a UK company operating in the UK and not. That's changed, but, I guess there is a broader question about, has it really stimulated investment? I mean, in the DRC, I think almost certainly the answer is no, because of course it's not an FTA partner. We did make representations to the US to say, well, look, you at least need to be able to have a pragmatic application of FTA, because there's not very many FTA partners and it's really hard to become an FTA partner, so you're closing your doors quite a lot. They did ultimately do that with this whole critical minerals agreement sort of fudge, I guess you could call it, where, okay, technically you can be an FTA partner without an FTA if you sign one of these agreements. But of course that's become challenging because they signed one with Japan. That was very controversial in Congress, and they opened discussions with the UK and the EU to agree one, but they haven't managed to finalise that because, they haven't had the flexibility to be able to offer and take the things that those governments want, and that's meant that actually we're kind of stuck in this really awkward middle ground where the countries that benefit most from the IRA are not probably the ones you'd expect. I mean, this is where I kind of come back to, for me, the Inflation Reduction Act, I think has anecdotally had an impact on the market. We have seen the amount of investment in the US tick up. Not ironically, but funnily enough, the whole conversation about critical minerals and what an issue it is, I think that's also stimulated investment in the US. Just having that focus on it has, it's a strange thing to say, just people talking about it has done it, but I think it has. And so we are now, for the first time, going from seeing a US that had zero cobalt refining capacity, to having, I think, 4 or 5 different projects, some at quite late stages now, of setting up in the US, which is, of course, a success. My question, I guess, is most of these projects are struggling with money, and it comes to the question of CapEx and OpEx, especially when prices right now are quite low, which is, you have this, they call it the valley of death. It's this 7-8 year, whatever year gap between you get an investment, your first investment, so you can go and do feasibility studies and other things, to actually you're making stuff that you can sell. That's a long period, and it's really hard to bridge that gap. And we've got lots of companies who are doing the right thing, doing the thing that governments want them to do, but they're all saying, we're struggling because we can't keep getting more, we need more investment, but we can't get it into us. And then there's the second thing, which is, okay, once you're up and running, when you've got volatile prices and things like that, it makes it challenging to continue operating. I mean, right now, in the cobalt industry, many companies are really struggling because of where the cobalt price is. It's a huge issue for many companies. And, Henry talked about this idea that's being talked about in the White House about a price floor. I mean, yes, okay, that's quite interventionist.
And how would that work? Could you give everyone a sense of...
Yeah, I mean, I can talk about it from a cobalt perspective, but I guess it would vary. I mean, never assume that all critical minerals operate the same, because they're different markets and they have different requirements. But a price floor could be, well, we know the high point of cobalt in recent years has been $90,000 a ton. Low point, $25,000 a ton. We're kind of around that low point now. If you came in and said, okay, well, we'll agree a price of $40,000, roughly that's about 30% of the time it's below that. We'll top it up to a certain amount, so that if you're an investor, and I think this is one of the really interesting things, if you're an investor and you want to invest in the project, I don't know, I can't speak for Henry, but you want to invest in the project, if it's really risky, well, what do? You say, either I want more equity or a higher rate of interest to offset my risk. And that then means you're not able to either raise as much money if it's an equity stake. If it's a high interest rate, that's going to be on your OpEx. You're going to have to pay that, and that's going to prevent you from reinvesting and making profits. If you set a price floor, and an investor knows they're going to make a profit, come what may, suddenly they can invest much more confidently, take a smaller equity stake, they can lend at a lower interest rate, which just makes it more viable and interesting from the start. And so there's a number of things you can do. There's loan guarantees, there's stockpiling. How can stockpiling interact with the market in order to help prop up investment? There's all these sorts of things you can discuss. But I really think this is a conversation that needs to be had. Price floors is one, it will be controversial in the US because the Republicans will hate it. It's not very free market, but that's a conversation for another day. But those are the sorts of things that can move the needle in a really meaningful way, more so I would say than the Inflation Reduction Act subsidies, which have been effective, don't get me wrong. But I think, could that capital have been invested in a different way and could it have been more effective? I think probably, yeah.
Interesting. And Isabel, I'd like to get your thoughts on the US IRA. I mean, I grew up or got used to the idea the US could never do anything on climate, and they did pass this amazing piece of legislation. How effective do you think it's been? Because in a way it's got a lot of aims, right? A lot of but a lot of aims, creating jobs, creating sustainable jobs, combating China, lowering emissions. But I'm interested what you think in terms of combating China. Is it an effective piece of legislation?
Well, it has created jobs. It has supported the development of renewables in the US, which is a good thing. So it helps the US meet its climate goals. In terms of combating China, it depends on kind of where the battlefield is, really. Sorry. I was interested in what Mike was saying about the death zone of companies. I mean, if you're talking about setting up a rival industrial sector to combat China, both in terms of domestic markets and in world markets, I think the answer is not yet. There are a lot of obstacles to that. And I think that, there have been some sort of instructive cases of trying to do this without the kind of support that Mike's talking about. The Canada rare earths case, where you had an Australian company investing in Canada, which has the whole range of strategic minerals and rare earths, investing in extraction and in refining, all going fine till the price falls. China is, let's not say they're entirely magicians, but these price falls are quite convenient for China, and China, like Saudi Arabia, is in a position to affect the global price. So the company starts to go bankrupt, and guess who comes in and invests? A Chinese company. And the Chinese company then closes down the refining. So, what was a very good move to set up a local industry that could take on, local supply at least, and friendshoring, died because there wasn't the support to get through both the death zone and to survive Chinese attempts, rather successful so far, to maintain the monopoly. So that's the kind of thing that you're looking at. And if you look at the IRA, the question is how much of that has been successful in the United States. And I think it's probably not. The jury is still out on how resilient local industries that are created under the umbrella of the IRA will be. EVs are a particular issue. What is the United States going to do with EVs manufactured in Mexico, for example, by Chinese companies? There are a whole load of contradictory ambitions. So you want the United States to convert to EVs. You want them to be cheap enough to be attractive. They're cheap if they're coming in from Mexico, but then you have another national security problem. So I think as long as the consumer is subsidized, that might work. But I think there are a number of issues around the IRA which remain to be played out.
So are you saying that policies that completely restrict China, like Canada's restricted investment, the IRA's has a foreign entity of concern provision, so no Chinese company can be involved, are you saying that's actually counterproductive and that we should have some Chinese involvement?
I'm not sure that I am saying that. I think if you're not going to have Chinese involvement, then you need to be prepared to replicate Chinese tactics. I think you need to be aware that governments need to support, and governments need to have quite deep pockets in this, and that's a price worth paying.
And Pragna, I just wonder if we could talk a bit about The IRA is interesting because it doesn't really focus so much on sustainability. Whereas in the EU, we've had a lot of legislation. We have battery passport that's coming in that will have sustainability data. We have, carbon border adjustment mechanism, a whole slew of legislation. How effective do you think this is in attracting investment into Europe, or do you think it's just delaying it, increasing the time and the cost?
I think, it's definitely, I can see your argument for maybe is it delaying investment, but actually it's making bringing us right back to the fundamental reason as to why we are exploring critical minerals back onto the table in terms of we need to become more sustainable. We need our energy sources to become more sustainable. So companies are now considering that they need to shift all of their mining processing or whatever it is that they're working on to use renewable sources of energy. And that has been remarkable, I think, in terms of a success for bringing these standards and the battery regulation in. I do think that it's rattled some of the Asian companies in terms of when they are working with European OEMs, for example. We've definitely seen an uptick of demand for life cycle assessments and product carbon footprints of their processes, and on the back of that, then have had discussions with them around how they can then improve their processes. And I think seeing that impact is actually quite a success.
I do just wanted to get your thoughts on, is one issue with the sustainability of this whole supply chain in that it's hard to sort of coalesce over some standards, because taking the Indonesia angle, there are different processes within Indonesia, and some processes such as high pressure acid leaching, it doesn't sound great, but it is actually relatively low carbon, but it might have other impacts in terms of water and environment. So how do you ensure you're taking a holistic view, but you're coalescing around standards?
Yeah, definitely. It is very high impact on carbon as well, actually. But
it's pretty big on carbon.
So relatively.
I think, in terms of it's not just about CO2 emissions. Yes, water impacts and land use as well for when it comes for all the infrastructure required for mining and mineral processing is an issue. I think often what we're asked about is how does our case compare to a different supply chain, or something that you can actually demonstrate that by moving certain assets, certain locations, or using alternative sources of, processing equipment as well. That really does help to make that case of how impacts can be reduced by making these changes in technology. However, I guess I can see that we're going back to the investment question, because fundamentally shifts in technology then brings that uncertainty for investors. So I think that's where I notice that things start to slow down in terms of progress. So we've made the case on the environmental impact side of things, the economic case, to show that by creating these new industries, we would create jobs, we would, reshore, if you will. However, that part around government intervention and investment, it comes back to that.
And Mike and Henry as well, talking about the UK, Mike, you mentioned the cobalt refineries in the UK and how much more the UK can do. What kind of thing do you think the UK should do? I mean, we haven't really seen policy yet from the current government, unless you can tell us more. But what should UK do?
So there are a number of things the UK can do, and I would say you start from the point of what does the UK have that it can leverage. It has a very liquid, well-capitalized financial market that are looking for places to invest. I think a starting point is to go and speak to them and say, well, if you wanted to invest in a mining project or a refining project, what would stop you? and then going about addressing those barriers and how you fix them. I mean, for me, and I kind of alluded to this before, I could tell you all about cobalt and the barriers that exist in cobalt, but I can bet you anything it's probably different for copper or for nickel or for lithium. And so I don't think there is a one-size-fits-all, here's the playbook. I think there is here's a suite of measures, not all of which will be applicable in all cases, but we have these powers that we can use to support investment as and when they're needed, and then using the expertise that we have in the UK to build some of those mechanisms, to bring people together, to have those conversations. And I would say, I mean, I guess friendshoring is a word that comes up a lot. I guess there's three options you can have. One is onshoring. This happens a lot in the US. Frankly, I don't think there's any country that's capable of completely onshoring critical mineral value chains. Geology alone prevents that. Then there's the sense of friendshoring. So do you make sure that you've got capacity in friendly countries? Again, you run into the issues of, well, especially if your countries are developed economies, is there really a comparative advantage in all of those economies to sustain it? And if not, does that then lead you to protectionism in order to sustain it? Or is it a case of diversification, which is, okay, there may be risks of us having a relationship with China, but if it's only 10% of the market and we know we can recalibrate it, is that a problem? And I think this has to be the conversation about what can we do well? How can we get people to invest in others? How can we grow the pie, diversify the market? I mean, frankly, we talked about the DRC earlier. They would love to have some of those refining jobs. That's their ambition. In fact, they even want to have battery manufacturing jobs. I mean, it might seem a bit ambitious today, but they want that because that's the value addition. That's the thing that gets people out of, dangerous low-paid work and into good jobs, which grows the economy. And so how can we get those places with the investment they need? That could be British money. It could be British money going into the UK. In a sense, people often talk, and you mentioned this earlier, about mines in the DRC and who owns them and that being a security risk. Why do we never flip that on its head and say, well, actually having British companies operating in the DRC would be a good thing? And that would mean, my call to action would be, I would take an all-of-the-above strategy. I think there are some things we could do in the UK. Refining, I think, is something we do already and we can do more of. Mining, we've got mining companies in the UK. How do we get them going out into the world and investing? We've got experts, we've got expertise all over the place, consultancy, whatever. How do we get them to go out into the world? I think that all comes back to the same question, which is, if you go to the City of London today and say, here is, forgive me, a big, dirty, capital-intensive refining project, or the next big tech company, I think they're probably going to go with the tech company today. So how do you make the refining project more interesting?
And Henry, what can the UK do? Because it is fascinating that we have these mining companies, Anglo-American, founded 107 years ago, right? When China was pretty chaotic. So we have this long expertise. How can we become part of these supply chains?
I mean, I'm sort of repeating what I already said. It's not that attractive to a lot of them to go into the DRC. And there are some who were happy to do it, but there's a huge amount of ESG and reputational risk. You can't kind of force these companies to do it. You have to give them. You have to somehow find incentives to go and do it. And even then, how do you ensure that those metals come back to benefit the UK? And how do you put that into the sort of the offtake agreements and things to ensure that benefits the Western supply chain rather than just all essentially just get shipped to China where most of it gets processed?
But do you not see an ESG backlash? Because we saw Glencore say they're going to keep their coal. Things seem to have changed, right? Is that, in a weird way, enabling more investment in this area, potentially?
Sorry, what's the...
There's been a backlash against ESG, and companies like Glencore said they're going to hold on to their coal assets. Is that, in a way, could enable more investment in this sector if they feel less afraid by the ESG pressures?
Well, I think that that's about economics. That they're going to make a lot of money from staying in coal. They're going to have to weigh up whether they're going to make a lot of money and have huge reputational issues and have going into the, there was a sort of not systematic, but a periodic exit of US companies, Freeport being the last, whatever it was in 2020, leaving the DRC. Maybe because it costs too much to be able to do it in a way that's sustainable. I don't know. I mean, that's something that governments need to try and help. That's where government intervention needs to come in and say, right, these are projects of national security. We have to make it worthwhile. National companies going in and operating these projects, because there's only a handful of people in the world who could probably operate. Let's say companies big enough to operate some of those assets. How the UK, I mean, it's not obvious how the UK should play the critical mineral space, where it should play. It's difficult, battery manufacturing, we're seeing the issues with Northvolt. It's highly capital intensive. It needs way more money than people thought, and obviously cost inflation's had a big impact. I mean, I don't even want to talk about British Volt because that suffered from other issues as well. But it's a difficult business, and you have to have security over the supply of the inputs. The UK does have some. I mean, Techmet was the biggest funders of any energy transition metal project in the UK until we brought in the UK government. They came in alongside us last summer with our investment in Cornish lithium, and Cornwall could be could move the needle for the UK supply of lithium. I mean, it's a way out, and whether it would supply all of the inputs required for a gigafactory, I don't know, but it can work, and there's hard rock and brine projects down in Cornwall. It's a great project, and it's now been marked as a project of strategic national importance by Angela Rayner, which is great, because that's exactly, and then it should be fast tracked with on the permitting side. It should be given sort of find ways of having sort of tax incentives or whatever it can have to ensure that it doesn't fail, because actually that's what you need, the units of lithium, right? That's what China realized. They needed the units, so they subsidized companies to go and get them, and therefore they could build the whole infrastructure around it. The UK's got a lot of legacy relationships in its foreign office that in producing countries that we don't properly leverage, and the UK could probably position itself, between the US and the EU and some of those countries to help, build those relationships. I don't know what is being done around there, but it's got a lot it could do, but we don't have the kind of funding, and we don't have the long-term industrial policy making that governments will probably put in place. And then where do we want to play in it? What's the end game? Because ultimately it's industrial competitiveness. Are we going to have an auto sector, essentially, or are we just going to assemble the parts here and import the batteries from somewhere else?
And you mentioned Cornish lithium. I do think it's a fascinating question, which is one about innovation. And in lithium, we're seeing new techniques such as direct lithium extraction. And if you look back at fracking in the US, I mean, the US has gone from big oil importer to the biggest oil producer in the world, right? And it's an extraordinary change in the geopolitical landscape because of that shift. But it came from innovation, from entrepreneurs, pioneers. I wonder if you think we're going to see a similar thing in the lithium sector with these new techniques, with oil companies coming into the sector.
I hope so.
Yeah.
We're this is great. I mean, this is just teeing me up here. I mean, the most, you can't, apart from green bushes, you can't really compete with the salars in South America for cost. I don't know where DLE will eventually sit on the cost curve. I suspect in various places on the cost curve. You will probably have it in Q1 to 4. It's complex. It's not one size fits all. The brines are very different. The technologies that you need to extract lithium from those brines are quite different, and they work on some and not on others. We have been the biggest investor in ESM, which has the Iliad technology, which SLB Schlumberger have just proven up in one of their plants in the US. We're working alongside a number of the oil servicing companies, and including SLB and others, who are shareholders in that company as well, to look at resources in the Smackover and other places to use DLE, because it hopefully will move the needle, but it's going to be a while before the kind of quantities come online, and the costs get to where they need to be, and it's in a nascent industry. But the US government, again, because the IRA is not just tax incentives. The IRA has enabled a lot of funding for the Department of Energy and the loans program, and there's a huge amount of money that can be spent from the Department of Energy into supporting the US companies, and direct lithium extraction is one of those areas that they're focused on, and it's exciting.
Yeah, I think they've got over 200 billion to lend or something like that.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Isabel, just before I open it up to questions, I mean, when you look at clean energy, look at China's advantage, how much is innovation going to enable the West to catch up? Because actually we saw after the financial crisis, a lot of the innovative clean technology startups in the US failed, right? And you saw China the standard product just got cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, right? So you couldn't compete against a moving train. But, innovation is one of our strong suits, right?
Yes, but I think that I would caution against the assumption that China can't innovate. I think 10 years ago people used to say, well, China can innovate in business methodology, super efficient supply chains and all of that, but can't do scientific or technological innovation. And I think I would be quite careful about that now, partly because they have built up a lot of industrial experience, and innovation in some sectors comes from practice. I mean, how do you iterate, you innovate, and China's in a very good position to do that. Plus, there is a huge amount of state investment thrown at the notion of innovation. I don't think it yields particularly effective returns, but every now and then, you have to get a win. So I think. There are clearly some sectors where China is struggling to catch up, particularly in very, very high-end chips, where Taiwan still has a very powerful edge, which they intend to keep. But in terms of the kind of general mining, refining, I would be very surprised if China isn't in a position to compete very effectively on innovation. And if you think at the kind of enormous, we're talking about the reluctance of Western capital to go into Africa. We've just seen, 50 African leaders, being celebrated in the FOCAC summit in Beijing. That's, a regular event. You've got a massive national policy towards Africa, which is now 15, 20 years old, and has enabled not just state enterprises to go into Africa, but private companies of every size to go into Africa. And a lot of the stereotypes that we have about the way China operates are constantly being overtaken by reality. It's not true anymore that China doesn't create jobs in Africa. China does. It's not true that there is no technology transfer. There is, in some sectors, quite important technology transfer in Africa. And I think that on innovation, we're probably a bit stuck in our own prejudices too. So, look, sectors like the battery business are a hotbed of innovation. China's the leading producer of batteries. I think that China will innovate as well as we will. They're always looking for new and cheaper ways to do things, more effective ways to do things. So, yes, we can compete, but we shouldn't assume that China is a passive player here.
No, very important point. I'd love to open it up for questions. There's microphones coming around. Oh, good, lots of questions. Should we start here at the front? Yeah, gentleman here in the front.
Thank you. Mike Barber, Independent. Thanks very much for the panel. Really interesting. A couple of quick questions. Henry and Mike, I think you both talked to the racing certainty, my words, not yours, that some of the prices of these critical minerals will be way higher at the end of the decade than they are now. So question one was, I wondered, is it within the remit of the UK Committee on Climate Change to comment on availability of critical minerals required to affect the energy transition, as they do on other dimensions of investment and innovation? And then question two, about a year ago, there was quite a bit of chat around deep sea mining and a lot of concern about the ecological impact, the unknown ecological impact that would have. I haven't seen much chat on deep sea mining for quite a while now, and I just wondered, has that gone away, or is that an alternative route to addressing some of the ESG challenges with securing critical mineral supply in harder parts of the world?
Shall I answer the second one and you answer the first?
I can do both, but you can
Go for it.
You can start.
We're not involved in. I mean, we're aware of the deep sea mining initiatives. We're not involved because it's kind of exploration and it's pre-exploration. I mean, it's really early stages. There's a lot of work to be done to understand, the sea floor and the impacts and all that kind of stuff. And we generally don't invest in anything that's kind of exploration, even if it's on land. So kind of, we want to be in things that are kind of 2 years to production. So there's a lot of work going on around it, but we're not really focused on it. There's a lot on the surface that is the economics as well for seabed mining are going to be a real problem, right? It's hard enough to get it when it's on dry land. So there's a lot that needs to be seen on that.
Yeah, so I'll start maybe with the deep sea question. Our position is very similar. I mean, at the minute, there's lots of studies going on, and there really isn't enough data and evidence yet to show whether it can be done sustainably. And I think that's a prerequisite, is to know, because of course potentially the impacts are significant, because the way the food chain works in the deep sea is that the food rises up from the bottom. And so yes, there's not much life on the bottom, but if you starve all the stuff that's above, that's not great either. So, we don't have enough data and evidence to know about it yet. I mean, what I can say is the ISA is still looking at this. I think it's been delayed because of the mining code and some of the other things that they're working on. Probably in the next year or two, I expect you might even see stuff starting to be brought up. I know the metals company recently refined the first nodules in Japan to demonstrate that it would work. So it's happening. I know we talk about China a lot today. There's a lot of those licenses in the deep sea and in the Pacific, which are between Hawaii and North America. So it's slightly uncomfortable for the US that those licenses are being snapped up by Chinese companies, amongst others, but including Chinese companies. I think it is a conversation that's coming. I would hope it would be led by some of the science and the evidence, but it's too early to say. On your second question about the Committee on Climate Change, it's a great point. I don't think they do have that remit. There is the Critical Minerals Intelligence Centre, which was set up under the previous administration. I know that was part of their remit to look at it. US Geological Survey obviously has some of that expertise too. I guess those things all exist. One thing I would say, this isn't really an official position, but it's a thought. We often talk about critical minerals in the context of the energy transition, but of course they're not only used in the energy transition. I think one of the growing conversations around critical minerals actually is defence in the current climate for a whole, we're in RUSI, so of course that's not a surprise, but for a whole range of reasons. And so maybe it's also slightly broader than just the Committee on Climate Change, because one thing I would always say is this is not a policy area that you can pigeonhole into DESNES or whatever. It has to be a cross-government approach because it affects so many different things and it underpins in many ways industrial strategy.
Great, thanks very much. And question here.
Sorry, I keep asking questions at the conference here. So again, Al, Macquarie Group. Kind of piggybacking on the previous comment around the defense angle to this. You know, the U.S. had a few years ago launched the MSP, the Middle Security Partnership, and obviously the EU is involved. I think the UK is involved, and a few other Asian countries as well. When we're thinking about kind of the, you know, building, whether it's codes of practice or maybe updating kind of new standards of responsible mining for critical minerals on the ESG side, how seriously should people look at initiatives like that as, you know, relevant or really irrelevant when we're thinking about we need to bring responsible actors into the DRC? Will they get top cover from U.S. government, the State Department, and, you know, and allied governments like that for them to say, we have that top cover, we're coming under MSP, so, you know, we can not override, but we can address those human rights and other kind of more governance, the S and the G concerns when it comes to going into sensitive countries like the DRC to mine. So, you know, it's kind of pretty low public profile, that partnership. I wonder if you have any thoughts on initiatives like that, and either from a market's perspective, how seriously should those be taken going forward in terms of the evolution of whether, whether companies with, you know, kind of see a change in that landscape that support kind of, you know, to get comfortable on the ESG side to go into these sensitive places to invest.
Yeah, who wants to take that? Mike, you
I
go first.
I can talk a bit about that. So I guess there's two parts to that. There's the ESG angle and there's the MSP angle. I mean, in ESG, specifically in the DRC, I mean, a lot of the problems we see are it's called the artisanal and small-scale mining sector. That's what everyone calls it. I mean, it's people with pickaxes and spades in some cases. In the DRC, much of the cobalt, someone described it to me as a bit like raisins in a fruitcake, i.e. it's poking at the ground, and it's pretty easy to get to. So you've got people who are earning less than $1,000 a year, who have veins of cobalt sticking out the ground that are worth well over $1,000, and you're surprised when people get a pickaxe and go and dig it up. And of course, that's, you know, why the artisanal sector happens. It's unregulated, it's mostly illegal. But it happens, and the danger of saying, well, okay, we're going to stop that, is that you increase poverty and you create potentially social cohesion consequences as a result of that. So there really has to be a conversation about how do you formalize that supply chain, how do you give them a route to sell it legally and properly with, you know, proper ESG standards and mined responsibly, whilst also giving people jobs and opportunities that prevent the need from doing that. I mean, that's just to address that particular point. I mean, does the MSP do something on that? I mean, I'd say it's too early to say. There's been a lot of conflicts between the EU on the one hand and the US on the other. The US has wanted to go 100 miles an hour. The EU's kind of said, let's hold back a bit, let's do our due diligence a bit more. It's led to frustration on both sides. It's restricted the amount of capital that it's really invested. I think it's got the potential to be quite good, and I think fundamentally doing this in a cross-government way, I think, is the right way of doing it. And by the way, the UK's got a role in that as well, which is very important. So, you know, that is a positive step. I guess it's the tension between the idea and the practice and making sure the practice works.
Do you have any thoughts on MSP?
I think you actually summed it up really well. So yeah, nothing further to add.
I mean, I think MSP is quite a good way of starting to codify, you know, alliances with countries that are sort of aligned, and so the US, the EU, Canada, Australia, Japan, South Korea. There's, you know, these are useful alignments to say, right, we want to look at this all together and to combine together to put pressure on supply chains and the ESG side of things is good. So I think to begin with, it's not doing a huge amount, and there are obviously issues that Mike alluded to in terms of how fast the US want to go versus Europe. I mean, in Europe, I don't know if anyone read the Draghi report this week, but he had some quite, you know, some good ideas of, like, you know, putting a rocket up some of the things that they need to be doing, and having a sort of mineral, I can't remember what it's called, raw materials platform that they can kind of combine together and all of these things are quite good ideas to to create bigger markets and more leverage and more funding and pressure to build independent supplies essentially outside the dominant China.
Simon. Thank you very much. Simon Clark at Kaya. Great panel, thank you. There was a lot of conversation about price guarantees, and clearly there's movement in the US around that. Could you imagine the UK, the EU, and the US doing something together?
Pricing what? Guarantees.
Price guarantees.
I can maybe jump in on that if you want. I mean, yes, in theory. I think it's going to be very hard in practice, though. That's quite interventionist, and there will be a great many people who will feel deeply uncomfortable doing that. I think also the devil is in the detail, because it could become quite expensive. If you said, for example, we're going to underwrite the cost of all copper mines globally, non-Chinese ones, I presume, that would be a very expensive thing to do. And so I think you would have to work out how that would work in practice. I mean, I guess the fundamental question you're asking is, should these financial mechanisms be coordinated at a sort of MSP level or a global level? I think yes. I think it would make a hell of a lot more sense to do it that way. There are different political cultures, which makes it difficult, and maybe things will move faster at a sort of jurisdictional level than at an MSP level. But in theory, yes.
Yeah, I mean, we talked a little bit about the White House coming out with the idea of a backstop, and how that actually works in practice is not totally clear. But if they basically just guaranteed the difference between the sales price, we're going to have to become quite imaginative about how a lot of these projects are funded, and OEMs are going to have to go much further upstream and start financing operations where they just haven't been used to it. They click a finger and they get aluminium, and they're in the driving seat, and VW and whoever basically call the shots. It's quite different. I mean, they don't know where they're going to get the units of lithium and nickel and cobalt from, and if they're doing NMC, and certainly lithium. Tesla needs what, like 150% the total current global supply of lithium if it was to reach its sales projections by 2030 every year. China dominates the supply chain with about 70% of the lithium supply. BYD and CATL are way ahead. They make really good cars cheaply. So if they're taking, what happens to Toyota, VW, Ford, GM? This is so they're going to have to enter the supply chain further up, and they're going to have to get used to financing projects, and they're also going to have to be part of providing price floors, and being able to say, in return for offtake, we will fund at the project level, and we will buy at X price, but we want X% of your offtake when it's produced. I sort of avoided the question earlier about kind of an independent price and an ESG price, and this sort of it's history would show that traders and OEMs will go for the lowest price. I mean, they're still most of our most of the EVs are probably using Indonesian nickel if they're NMC batteries. So we'll have to see what happens on that.
Yeah, that's a good point. Question. Oh, sorry, at the back first. Yeah.
Dan Smith, University of Leicester and FCDO. There's quite a few of the critical metals that are recovered exclusively as byproducts, and quite a few of those have sat excluding a bit of volatility at pretty much the cost of production for a long time, so they're poorly incentivized for people to recover them. Is there an opportunity, therefore, to perhaps regulate their production or to incentivize it through adding it to ESG metrics instead? Essentially, we dig them up and then bury them somewhere slightly different.
Yeah, who wants to take that?
Have you got which byproducts are you meaning specifically?
up until quite recently, antimony was pretty much trading at cost, as far as I understand it. So the FT was reporting US antimony producers complaining that they couldn't make any profit until China put export quotas on it. Tellurium and selenium, selenium not on the UK list, tellurium is, they variously trade at pretty much close to cost. They're not hugely profitable.
I mean, I can't talk for those ones. I mean, clearly in our focus metals, cobalt is the byproduct of copper, and that there are I mean, almost no primary cobalt producers. I mean, yes, it would be a good idea, but it's all down to economics. And if it's gonna help the bottom line for companies, then they'll do it. If it's not, then they won't.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to add to what you were saying, Henry, is often as well when you get juniors, like mining juniors, looking to set up, e.g. lithium, then there are cases where they've discovered that actually they have, for example, cesium or rubidium or something like that in their waste stream. So from the environmental angle, then dealing with the tailings can help for reducing the environmental impacts. But then the economic case has to be made. So where it's that extra step of discovering where those other metals would be of value, which sectors, and often that's where things fall down because there either isn't a strong case or it's not considered a critical mineral. So yeah, I think the economics is a strong point in that.
Yeah, I'd just say the same thing, which is I think critical minerals is a global market. It will remain a global market, and it will remain market driven. I think my challenge, I think you were kind of referring to like a price premium for ESG, high ESG raw materials. My issue with that is that someone has to pay that premium. And I don't know who that someone is, especially at the minute, because you've seen all the news stories about automotive manufacturers, for example, who already have very slim margins, and we're asking them to make them even slimmer still. I mean, the cost of the battery, I think, is something like 20 to 25% of the cost of the end, of the raw materials is of the end of the cost EV. So if you increase that, it's increasing the end of the end price of the vehicle. So either consumers pay it or the automotive company absorbs it. The automotive companies aren't really in a position to absorb it at the minute. Are consumers going to pay that premium for it for the same vehicle? I think those are questions we don't really know the answer to. And the danger of some of this is you introduce a price premium and then people who don't pay the price premium undercut you, and then your only option is either you step back, you accidentally incentivize low ESG, you reverse subsidize low ESG products, or you have to create tariff barriers, a sort of carbon border adjustment mechanism, but for ESG raw materials, and suddenly you've got a protectionist market potentially, which means your domestic automotive companies can't be globally competitive because they can only exist with the benefit of tariffs. It's just a sort of cascade, I think, that risks complicating the market. Much easier, I think, is to think, how do you work with the market to boost this? I mean, I don't know the specific elements in question that you're talking about, and I think you'd have to look at those. But I guess that sort of goes to my point earlier, which is I don't think we can also assume there is a one-size-fits-all solution for all the raw materials. I think you need to go through one by one and say, what are the barriers in this particular market, and what can we do? Because it will differ.
Got it. Mikhail at the front.
Michal Meidan, Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. I mean, it's clear that we need diversification, but we're doing it in a fragmented world, but also markets and companies optimize. Within that context, how do we think about joint ventures, or is it a bad word to say partnerships with Chinese companies? How do you think about the trade-offs between, the expertise, the technology, the risk appetite the Chinese companies bring with them to some of these ventures, versus the political risk that could emerge from partnering with Chinese companies? How do you know where cost of capital fits in? Is there a higher risk premium to operating with Chinese, or actually do they bring with them the cost capital? So how do you think about, I guess, the trade-offs of partnering with Chinese companies? Can I ask a second question? You talked about sort of price volatility and how China controls prices. Is there a role, or is there any way that the UK or other countries, markets, could increase sort of the transparency in price formation or play an active role in price discovery?
Okay, good questions. Isabel, I'd be interested about JVs, because that's how China built a lot of this industry, is the other way around.
Yeah.
Should we, again, take a leaf out of that playbook?
Yes, I think we should. I mean, I think it's you're looking at a very different proposition if between China destroying jobs and China creating jobs, particularly in Europe. And you're seeing JVs kind of emerging in Europe. I think that they need to be. I think we should take a leaf out of the Chinese regulatory book, to be honest. Ensure that it involves that JVs involve IP transfer and all the desirable things that you want, and that certainly when JVs, in the early days of JVs in China, there was a limit on foreign ownership, so you could only have 49%. So I think that all of those would be useful lessons at this point as we kind of explore where we can cooperate and where we can't. And I think also it very much depends on the sector, what's considered a security risk and what isn't. And I think that's something that we're still figuring out. But in principle, yes.
And anyone else on either of those two questions?
Are you talking about the upstream and midstream, or are you talking about the battery manufacturing and things? I mean, the US isn't going to do any with China.
But we do see deals, right? CATL agreeing to license their technology.
Absolutely.
We do see it happening in the US, right?
No, sure, but in terms of the upstream,
yeah.
That there haven't been any.
But aren't they choosing to partner with South Korean companies?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's kind of it's kind of inevitable in a lot of the world, right? We can't have an energy transition with China. They're totally dominant, and if we're going to move things forward, I think the processing side. I mean, there's a lot of sort of JVs going on the processing. I think I'm thinking in my mind about UK and the EU here, because that's obviously the EU's where it's mostly happened. I think the Europe needs to kind of decide what it wants to do as well, because what is VW going to be? What is, are they going to be a car company, or are they just going to essentially end up importing batteries? Because the Chinese don't want to import lithium carbonate into Europe. They want to import cars. So, I think it's going to be inevitable, and we need to do as much as we can as a world to do as quickly as we can to. But we also have to create independent and ensure that we're not beholden to, Chinese dominance over it. So it's a tricky balance.
And Mike or anyone else, what about the price, making price more transparent? I mean, the Cobalt market is a good example, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that comes up a lot, and it's a really interesting question. I guess yes is the simple answer. I think, especially on some of the smaller tonnage commodities, the way that they are priced, typically the pricing of cobalt's done through fast markets, but you're increasingly seeing, for example, the Shanghai price used for sulfates. I know that there's lots of policymakers thinking about how, this whole political discussion that, I don't really have a view on, but, is happening about, well, is, setting that price, is that a quite important political lever? Because if the price is being set in fast markets in London versus the Shanghai price in Shanghai, what does that mean politically? Now, I don't have a sort of stake in the ground on that, but I know it's a conversation that's being had. I think that's something that could be looked at, but I don't have a particular view on that.
Interesting. Well, I think that's all we have time for now. So please join me in thanking our panelists for today.